Hey, welcome to Horror Ecos. Before we start, just a quick note. After the first few minutes, the rest of the video plays without breaks. So get comfortable and give it a try. I think you'll enjoy these stories. If you do, you can like and subscribe. Only if you really want to. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time it is for you? I read them every night. All right, let's begin tonight's story. Stories start now. My dead father appeared in my nightmare and ended 25 years of terror. An evil spirit haunted my dreams for 25 years. And then my father, who had been dead for only 3 months, walked through a door and told me to pack my things and leave while he dealt with it. That is the impossible truth that sits at the center of my life. The experience that changed everything about how I understand dreams and death, and the connections that persist between people who love each other even after one of them is gone. For a quarter of a century, from my late teens until I was in my 40s, I had the same nightmare over and over again. The same presence, the same terror, the same feeling of being paralyzed with fear, while something malevolent waited for me at the other end of the house. And then my father died, and a few months later he appeared in that nightmare, gave me very specific instructions, and the dream never came back. I have not had that nightmare once in the 10 years since. Not a single time. After 25 years of recurring terror, after thousands of nights wondering if this would be the night the dream returned, it simply stopped. Completely. Permanently. As if whatever had been tormenting me all those years had been confronted and removed by my father in a single dream encounter. I need to tell you this story from the beginning, because the length and persistence of the nightmare matters just as much as the way it ended. This was not a bad dream I had a few times. This was a psychological haunting that spanned decades of my life, that shaped my relationship with sleep and fear, and my own subconscious mind in ways that are difficult to fully express. The dream started when I was in my late teens. I cannot pinpoint the exact first occurrence, cannot tell you the precise night when it began, but I remember being 17 or 18 years old and having this dream that felt different from other dreams. More vivid and more viscerally frightening in a way that ordinary nightmares were not. The basic structure was always the same. I would be in a house, and there would be an evil spirit on the top floor. I never saw the spirit clearly, never had a visual image of what it looked like, but I could feel it. I knew exactly where it was at any given moment in the dream. I could sense its presence the way you sense someone staring at you from across a room. That prickling awareness that something is watching you, paying attention to you, focusing on you in a way that feels wrong. The house itself would change. Sometimes it was a version of the house I actually lived in. My childhood home or whatever apartment or house I was living in at that particular time in my life. Sometimes it was a completely unfamiliar house. A dream construction that resembled nothing I had ever seen in waking life. But regardless of which house it was, the layout was always the same in the important ways. There was an upstairs. There was a downstairs. My bedroom was upstairs. And the evil spirit was also upstairs, at the opposite end of the house from where I was. The spirit never came downstairs. That was one of the consistent rules of the dream. One of the fixed parameters that never changed no matter how many times I had this nightmare. Whatever this presence was, it was confined to the upper floor. It could move around up there, could shift position, could come closer to where I was. But it could not, or would not, cross the boundary between upstairs and downstairs. You would think that would have been comforting. That knowing it was trapped on the same floor as me, but unable to leave that floor, would have made me feel safer. But it did not work that way in the dream, because I was also upstairs. My bedroom was up there, and that meant I was in its territory, sharing space with something that I knew, with absolute certainty, wanted to harm me. The feeling in the dream was one of creeping paralysis. I would be in my bedroom, aware of the presence at the other end of the house, and I would feel fear spreading through my body like ice water moving through my veins. It would start as awareness and then build into anxiety and then escalate into full terror, and as the fear grew I would find myself less and less able to move. It was like that phenomenon of sleep paralysis that some people experience, where you are conscious but your body will not respond to your commands. Where you are trapped between sleeping and waking and cannot make yourself move, no matter how hard you try. Except this was happening within the dream itself, not in the transitional state between sleep and waking. I was asleep and dreaming, and within that dream I was becoming paralyzed with fear. My body growing heavier and slower, and less responsive even as my mind screamed at me to run, to get out, to get downstairs where the spirit could not follow. Sometimes I would manage to move, to force myself into motion despite the fear and the paralysis. I would make it out of the bedroom, into the hallway, toward the stairs. But I was always moving too slowly, like I was wading through water or trying to run in a swimming pool. Every movement requiring enormous effort and producing minimal results. And the spirit would be there, not visible but present, getting closer. And I would know that I was not going to make it, that I was not going to reach the stairs in time, that something terrible was about to happen. And then I would wake up, heart pounding, covered in sweat, that particular cocktail of adrenaline and relief that comes when you surface from a nightmare and realize it was just a dream. I would lie there in the dark, in my actual bedroom, reminding myself that none of it was real, that there was no evil presence in the house, that I was safe. And then weeks or months would pass, and I would have the dream again. This went on for years, through my late teens and into my 20s. Through my 20s and into my 30s, the dream would come and go, sometimes frequent, and sometimes absent for long stretches, but always returning eventually. Always the same basic structure, always the same presence, always the same paralyzing fear. I tried everything I could think of to make it stop. I read about dream interpretation, looking for psychological explanations for why I kept having this nightmare, and what it might represent about my unconscious mind. I talked about it in therapy. I tried changing my sleep habits, my diet, my stress levels, everything that conventional wisdom suggested might affect the content and quality of dreams. Nothing worked. The dream kept coming back. In my 30s, I started reading about lucid dreaming, the practice of becoming aware that you are dreaming while still in the dream state, and then taking conscious control of what happens. The idea appealed to me as a potential solution to my recurring nightmare. If I could become aware that I was dreaming while the nightmare was happening, maybe I could change the outcome, could confront the presence instead of running from it, could take control of my own subconscious landscape instead of being a passive victim of whatever my sleeping mind threw at me. So, I started practicing. I would go to bed with the intention of recognizing when I was dreaming. I would perform reality checks throughout the day, small tests that would tell you whether you were awake or asleep, training my mind to ask that question automatically so that it would carry over into my dreams. And gradually, over time, I started having moments of lucidity within the nightmare. Brief flashes where I would realize, while the dream was happening, that this was the dream. That I was asleep, that none of this was real, and therefore I did not have to be bound by its rules or terrorized by its presence. When those moments of lucidity came, I made a decision. Instead of trying to flee, instead of attempting to get downstairs and away from the spirit, I would try to confront it. I would muster up all the courage I could find within the dream, and I would move toward the presence instead of away from it. I would try to communicate with it, to ask it what it wanted, to tell it to leave me alone. This was terrifying in ways that are difficult to describe. moving towards something that you know wants to harm you, forcing yourself to approach it instead of running away, goes against every instinct. Even knowing that it was a dream, even having that intellectual awareness that this was all happening in my own mind and therefore could not actually hurt me, did not make it any less frightening to deliberately walk toward the source of the terror. But I did it, multiple times, over the course of years. Whenever I managed to achieve lucidity within the nightmare, I would force myself to confront the presence. It never worked the way I hoped it would. The spirit would not communicate with me. It would not respond to my questions or my demands that it leave me alone. Instead, when I got close to it, when I entered whatever space it occupied at the far end of the house, it would attack. Not in any physical, violent way that involved weapons or visible harm. But it would pick me up and throw me. I would feel myself lifted off the ground by some invisible force, hurled across the room, slammed into walls or furniture. Over and over, a violent rejection of my attempt to engage with it. A demonstration that it was stronger than me, and that my courage or lucidity or attempts at control meant nothing in the face of its power. And then I would wake up, bruised psychologically if not physically, having failed once again to resolve this thing that had been haunting me for years. I kept trying. I never gave up on the idea that if I could just find the right approach, the right words, the right level of courage or control, I could convince this presence to leave me alone. But nothing I did made any difference. The dream continued. The spirit remained, and I continued to wake up in terror over and over for more than 2 decades. I want to pause here and acknowledge how this must sound to anyone who has not experienced something like this. A recurring nightmare that lasts for 25 years sounds extreme, sounds like something that would require psychological intervention or medication, or some kind of serious treatment beyond what I was doing. But it was not constant. It was not every night or even every week. Sometimes months would pass between occurrences. The nightmare would fade into the background of my life, would become something I barely thought about during my waking hours, and then it would return, and I would remember all over again that this thing was still with me, still part of my psychological landscape, still unresolved. And in between the nightmares, life continued normally. I had relationships, a career, hobbies, all the ordinary components of a normal adult existence. The nightmare was compartmentalized. Something that happened in my sleep, but did not dominate my waking life in any obvious way. Or at least that is what I told myself. Looking back now, I can see how it affected me in subtle ways. How I developed a low-level anxiety about going to sleep. A small reluctance to fully surrender to unconsciousness, because I never knew if this would be the night the dream returned. How I became someone who was comfortable discussing nightmares and fear, and the darker aspects of the human psyche. Because I had been living with those things for so long that they felt familiar rather than foreign. But I functioned. I lived, and the nightmare, as terrifying as it was, remained contained within the boundaries of sleep. My father died when I was 41 years old. This was a significant loss, obviously, the kind of event that reshapes your life and your identity in fundamental ways. I will not go into the details of his death because they are not particularly relevant to this story, and because some aspects of grief remain private even when you are sharing other parts of your experience. What matters is that he was gone, that the person who had been my father for my entire life was no longer alive. That I was navigating the world without him in it, learning how to carry that absence, figuring out who I was in the aftermath of that loss. I thought about him constantly in the months after he died. Missed him in ways both large and small. Wished I could talk to him about things that came up. Felt the hole his absence had created in the fabric of my daily life. And I dreamed about him sometimes, the way people often dream about loved ones who have died. Normal dreams where he was alive and present, and we were doing ordinary things together. And then I would wake up and remember that he was gone, and feel the loss all over again. Those dreams felt like my own mind processing grief, creating scenarios where I could still interact with him, even though he was no longer available in waking life. They did not feel significant or mysterious or like anything other than what dreams usually are. My subconscious working through emotions and memories while I slept. But then, a few months after he died, I had the nightmare again. The same one I had been having for 25 years. The same house, the same presence on the upper floor, the same creeping paralysis of fear. Except this time, there was something new. There was a door. This had never been part of the dream before. The layout had always been consistent in its essentials, familiar even when the specific details changed. And there had never been this particular door before. But now, in this iteration of the nightmare, there it was, a door that had not existed in any previous version of the dream. And the door opened. And my father was standing in the doorway. Not as he had been at the end of his life, not diminished by illness or age, but as I remembered him from earlier times. Strong, present, completely himself in a way that made his identity unmistakable even though this was a dream, and dreams often distort things. He spoke to me. His voice was clear and direct, with an authority and urgency that cut through the fog of fear that had been building. He said, "Come in this room right now." I obeyed immediately. There was no hesitation, no questioning, just immediate compliance with what was clearly a command, rather than a suggestion. I went through the door and into the room where he was standing, and he pointed to a suitcase. He said, "Pack all your belongings." I looked at the suitcase, then back at him, trying to understand what was happening, why he was here, what this meant. And he pointed across the room to another door. A door on the opposite side from where we had entered. He said, "Leave out that door." And then he said the most important thing, the words that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. He said, "I'm going to take care of everything. Don't look back. Leave right now." There was something in his tone, something in the way he said it, that made it clear this was serious. This was not a suggestion. This was not optional. This was a father protecting his child, taking care of a problem that the child could not handle alone, and the child's job was to do exactly what she was told without question or delay. So I did. I packed my belongings into the suitcase he had indicated. I went to the door he had pointed to, and I left. I did not look back. He had told me not to look back, and so I did not, even though every part of me wanted to know what was happening behind me, wanted to see what my father was doing to take care of everything. I went through the door, and I woke up. And I have not had that nightmare since. Not once. Not a single time in the 10 years that have passed since that night. A nightmare that had plagued me for 25 years, that had resisted every attempt I made to resolve it or control it or make it stop, simply ended. Completely. Permanently. The evil presence that had haunted my dreams since I was a teenager is gone. The paralysis, the fear, the sense of something malevolent waiting for me at the other end of the house, all of it vanished after that one dream, where my father appeared and told me to leave while he dealt with it. I cannot prove what happened that night. I cannot offer evidence that would satisfy a skeptic that what I experienced was anything more than a particularly vivid dream that happened to coincide with the resolution of a long-standing nightmare pattern. But I know what I believe. I believe my father came to me, not just as a memory or a construct of my grieving mind, but as an actual presence, operating from wherever he is now, reaching back across the boundary between life and death to help his daughter one more time. I believe he saw that I was still being tormented by this thing that had been with me for decades. This psychological haunting that I had been unable to resolve on my own despite years of trying. And I believe he did what fathers do. He stepped in. He dealt with it. He confronted whatever that presence was, and removed it from my life in a way that I had never been able to accomplish myself. The specifics of how he did it, what actually happened on the other side of that door after I left, I do not know, and will probably never know. That was not my job. My job was to trust him, to follow his instructions, to leave and not look back while he took care of everything. And he did take care of everything. Whatever he did, however he confronted that presence, it worked. The nightmare is gone. I have had other dreams of my father since that night. Many of them. Dreams where he appears and we talk, or where he is just present in the background of whatever scenario my sleeping mind has created. And those dreams feel different from the one where he saved me. Those feel like normal dreams. Like my own mind creating scenarios where I can still interact with him because I miss him. And my subconscious is giving me that small comfort. But the dream where he came through the door and told me to pack my things and leave while he dealt with the evil presence, that one feels different. That one has a weight and a reality to it that the other dreams do not. That one changed something fundamental not just in my dream life but in my understanding of what is possible and what connections persist after death. I think about it often. I think about the timing, how it happened just a few months after he died, when his presence would still have been strong. When whatever force or energy or consciousness he had become after leaving his physical body might have been most capable of reaching back to help those he loved. I think about the door that had never been in the nightmare before. The new element that appeared in a dream that had been structurally identical for 25 years. How that door opened, and my father was there. As if he had created that entrance specifically, so he could intervene. I think about his instructions. How specific and clear they were. Pack your things. Leave through that door. Don't look back. I'll take care of everything. Not vague dream logic or symbolic imagery, but practical directions delivered with the kind of authority that gets followed without question. And I think about the fact that it worked. That after 25 years of being unable to resolve this nightmare through any method I tried, it ended after one intervention from my father. That is not coincidence. That is not random dream evolution. That is intentional action producing a specific result. My father saved me that night. He came into my nightmare, and he removed whatever had been tormenting me, and he did it the same way he had protected me throughout his life, with strength and authority and an unshakable commitment to his daughter's well-being. The dreams I have of him now, the ones that I think are just my own mind missing him, do not have that same quality. They are sweet sometimes, sad sometimes, normal dreams that rise and fall with whatever is happening in my waking life. But that one dream, the one where he saved me from 25 years of recurring terror, stands apart. Sacred. Significant. Proof that love continues after death. That protection persists. That fathers can still help their children even from the other side of the grave. I will never forget it. I will carry it with me always. Not just as a memory, but as evidence that whatever we become after we die, we do not become separate from the people we loved. We do not become disconnected from their struggles or indifferent to their suffering. My father came when I needed him. He dealt with something I could not handle on my own. He sent me to safety and stayed behind to fight whatever needed fighting. And then he left me in peace, free from the nightmare that had haunted me since I was 17 years old. That is what fathers do, and that is what mine did, even after death could not stop him. The nightmare is gone. My father made sure of it. And I sleep peacefully now, knowing he is still taking care of me. Next one story start now. I heard anklets outside my window at 2 a.m. and no one believed me. The sound of anklets jingling right outside my bedroom window woke me in the middle of the night. And when my mother checked, there was absolutely no one there. That is the terrifying truth I need you to understand before I tell you the rest of this story. Because everything that follows depends on you grasping how impossible and how specific that sound was. This was not some vague noise that I misidentified in my half-asleep state. This was not the wind rattling the window, or a dog walking past, or any of the dozen ordinary explanations my family offered when I tried to tell them what had happened. This was the unmistakable, crystal-clear sound of pail. The traditional Indian anklets that make a distinctive tinkling, jingling noise when someone walks. And it was coming from directly outside my window at 2 o'clock in the morning, in a place where no one should have been standing. I heard it. I know what I heard. And the fact that my mother found no one there when she checked, the fact that my family did not believe me and told me I must have been mistaken, does not change what I experienced that night. It only makes it more frightening, more inexplicable, more impossible to dismiss as something ordinary that I simply misunderstood. This happened in 2016 when I was living with my family in a rented house in Rajasthan, India. For anyone reading this who is not familiar with India or with the way many Indian families live, especially in smaller towns and cities, it is common for multiple generations or family members to share living spaces in ways that might seem unusual to people from Western countries. Privacy is less of a priority than staying close together, keeping the family unit tight and connected. Our family consisted of 4 people: my mother, my father, my younger brother, and me. The house we were renting had multiple bedrooms, but we all chose to sleep together in one large room. This was partly practical, because that particular room was bigger and more comfortable than the others, and partly just preference. The way families sometimes gravitate towards sleeping in the same space even when they have other options available. The room we used for sleeping was significantly larger than the other 2 bedrooms in the house. It could comfortably fit all 4 of us with our sleeping arrangements, had decent ventilation, and felt like the natural choice for where the family should spend their nights. My parents slept on one side of the room. My brother and I had our sleeping areas on other parts of the floor or on beds, depending on how we arranged things on any given night. There was a window in that room. This detail is important, so I want to make sure you have a clear picture of it. The window was not particularly high up. Not one of those small windows near the ceiling that you sometimes see in bedrooms. It was at a normal height. The kind of window you could easily look out of while standing. The kind where someone outside could look in if they wanted to, though we usually kept curtains or coverings over it for privacy. This window faced a street at the back of the house. Not the main street where most of the traffic and activity happened, but a smaller back street. The kind that people used as a shortcut, or that connected different parts of the neighborhood without being a major thoroughfare. During the day, people would occasionally walk past, but at night, it was generally quiet and empty. The window itself was not in great condition. It was old, slightly loose in its frame. The kind of window that would rattle and make noise when the wind blew. This is relevant because later, when I tried to tell my family what had happened, one of their explanations was that I had heard the window making sounds, and had mistaken those sounds for something else. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the night it happened. About the sequence of events exactly as I experienced them, so you can understand why I am so certain about what I heard. It was a summer night. Summer in Rajasthan is intense, brutally hot during the day, and even at night the temperature does not drop as much as you might hope. We were all sleeping, or trying to sleep, in that big room with whatever ventilation we could get from the window, and any fans we had running. I woke up at some point in the middle of the night, not because of any external sound or disturbance, but because I was thirsty. This is a completely normal reason to wake up, especially during Rajasthan summer, when you are constantly drinking water to stay hydrated and your body needs it even while you sleep. I got up quietly, trying not to disturb anyone else in the room. I went to wherever we kept the water, drank some, and then came back to my sleeping area. I lay down with the intention of going right back to sleep. I was tired, it was the middle of the night, and I had no reason to stay awake. And that is when I heard it. The sound of payal. Anklets. The distinctive jingling, tinkling sound that comes from the small bells that are attached to traditional Indian anklets. The kind that women wear, and that make noise with every step they take. The sound was coming from directly outside the window. I need to explain what payals sound like for anyone who has never heard them, because the specificity of this sound is crucial to understanding why I could not have been mistaken about what I was hearing. Payal are not subtle. They are designed to make noise, to announce the presence of the person wearing them, to create a pleasant musical tinkling as they move. The sound is light but clear, rhythmic, following the pattern of footsteps. Each step produces a little burst of jingling as the bells move and strike against each other. It is a very distinctive sound. You cannot mistake it for wind chimes or rattling metal or any other random noise. Once you know what payals sound like, once you have heard them enough times to have that sound imprinted in your memory, you recognize it instantly and unmistakably. And that is what I was hearing outside my window. Not something that sort of resembled payal. Not a sound that might have been payal if I was generous with my interpretation. The actual, specific, unmistakable sound of someone wearing anklets and walking right outside that window. I froze. Completely froze in my sleeping position. My body rigid with fear. My mind racing to try to understand what I was hearing and whether I should be as terrified as I immediately felt. Because here is the thing. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. I know this because I checked the time, looked at whatever clock or phone I had access to, specifically noted the time. Because some part of me understood even then that this detail would be important if I ever tried to tell anyone about this experience. 2 in the morning. On a back street of a residential neighborhood. A time when no one should be walking past our house. Certainly no one should be standing directly outside our bedroom window. And absolutely no one should be wearing traditional anklets that announce their presence with every movement. Who walks around at 2 in the morning wearing payal? Why would someone be outside our specific window at that specific time? What possible innocent explanation could there be for what I was hearing? I could not think of one. And the longer I lay there listening, the more frightened I became. The sound continued for what felt like a long time, but was probably only a minute or two. The jingling of the anklets, steady and clear, as if someone was standing there, maybe shifting their weight from foot to foot, maybe pacing slightly, but definitely present. Definitely right outside that window. And then the sound stopped. Just stopped. Not gradually fading as if someone was walking away. Not changing in quality or volume, just suddenly absent. One moment I was hearing it clearly, the next moment there was only silence. The abrupt cessation of the sound was almost as frightening as the sound itself had been. Because it meant that whatever or whoever had been there had either left very quickly and very quietly, or had simply vanished. I waited for a moment, lying completely still, listening as hard as I could for any follow-up sounds, any indication of what had just happened, or where the source of the sound had gone. Nothing. Complete silence except for the normal nighttime sounds of the house and the street. And that is when I knew I could not just go back to sleep and pretend this had not happened. I was too scared, too shaken, too desperate for someone else to acknowledge what I had experienced and help me make sense of it. I got up and went across the room to where my mother was sleeping. I knelt down beside her and gently shook her awake, whispering urgently that she needed to wake up, that something had happened, that I needed her. My mother woke up groggily, confused about why I was waking her in the middle of the night. I imagine from her perspective I must have looked fairly distressed, because she became alert quickly, sitting up and asking me what was wrong. I told her everything. That I had woken up to drink water, that I had heard the sound of pail outside the window, that it had been clear and unmistakable, and had continued for a while before suddenly stopping. I told her how scared I was, how certain I was that something very strange had just happened. To my mother's credit, she took me seriously enough to investigate. She did not immediately dismiss me or tell me to go back to sleep without checking. She got up and went to the window. She opened it and looked outside, and there was no one there. The back street was completely empty. No person, no figure, no source for the sound I had heard. Just an empty street in the middle of the night. My mother looked for a long moment, checking as thoroughly as she could in the limited visibility, making sure she had not missed anyone who might be hiding or standing in shadows. But there was genuinely no one there. She turned back to me and said what I suppose any mother would say in that situation, trying to be reassuring while also dealing with her own need to get back to sleep. She told me that I must have been mistaken, that I probably heard some other sound and in my half-awake state interpreted it as pail, that it might have been the wind making the window rattle, or some animal moving around outside, or any number of ordinary explanations that would account for what I thought I heard without requiring anything supernatural or frightening to be true. She told me to come back to bed and go to sleep, that everything was fine, that there was nothing to worry about. But I was still scared, because I knew what I had heard. And I knew that it had not been the window rattling, had not been the wind, had not been any of the ordinary sounds that my mother was offering as explanations. The window did make noise when it was windy. I had heard that noise many times before. I knew what it sounded like, knew the quality of the rattle and shake, knew how it was different from other sounds. And what I had heard tonight was not that. What I had heard was pail, anklets, the unmistakable jingling of bells attached to someone's feet as they moved. But my mother had looked and found no one, and she seemed convinced that I had made a mistake, and I did not know how to argue with that, or make her understand how certain I was. So I went back to my sleeping area, lay down, and tried to convince myself that maybe she was right, maybe I had been confused, maybe it had been something else. Except I could not convince myself of that, because I remembered too clearly what the sound had been like, how specific and recognizable it was, how it had come from directly outside the window at the exact moment when I was lying awake and alert, not half asleep, or drowsy or confused. And here is the part that has bothered me ever since, the detail that makes this whole experience even stranger and more unsettling. The sound only happened when I was trying to go back to sleep. I had gotten up, drunk water, and returned to bed without hearing anything unusual. It was only after I lay down, only when I was settling into sleep again, that the sound of the anklets began. And it stopped as soon as I decided to wake my mother. As if whatever was making the sound knew that I was about to get help, that I was about to have someone else come check. And it needed to be gone before that happened. That awareness, that responsiveness to what I was doing, is what makes me certain this was not just some random coincidence of sound. This was something that was paying attention, that was timing its presence for maximum effect, that knew when I was alone and vulnerable, and when I was about to have backup. I did not sleep well for the rest of that night. I kept listening for the sound to come back, kept glancing at the window, kept feeling like something was watching or waiting outside. But the pail did not sound again. The rest of the night passed without incident. In the morning, I told my father what had happened. I explained the whole thing, hoping that in daylight and with more time to process it, my family would take it more seriously, would acknowledge that something genuinely strange had occurred. My father did not believe me either. He listened to my story, and then basically told me I was being too scared, too imaginative, too willing to interpret normal sounds as something supernatural. He used that affectionate but dismissive tone that parents sometimes use with children, who they think are overreacting. That tone that says, "I love you, but you are being silly." I remember feeling frustrated and invalidated, like no one in my family was willing to consider that I might actually know what I had experienced, that I might be reporting accurately on something real that had happened to me. They all seemed much more comfortable believing that I had made a mistake, had been confused by ordinary sounds, had let my imagination run away with me in the middle of the night. But I knew better. I knew what I had heard. And their disbelief, their alternate explanations, their gentle mockery did not change the fundamental reality of what had occurred. I heard Payal outside my window at 2 o'clock in the morning. Clear, unmistakable, the sound of anklets jingling as if someone was standing right there. And when my mother checked immediately after, there was no one there. That is not imagination. That is not mistaking one sound for another. That is something unexplainable happening. Something that does not fit into the normal rules of how the physical world works. I have thought about that night many times over the years since it happened. I have tried to come up with rational explanations that would account for everything I experienced, and I have failed, repeatedly, to find anything that fits all the details. Could it have been the window making noise? No, because I knew what the window sounded like, and this was not that sound. And because the window was on the inside of the wall, while the sound was clearly coming from outside, from the street side. Could it have been some animal? What animal makes a sound like Pale? What animal wears bells? And why would it be directly outside our window at exactly 2 in the morning? Could it have been a person actually wearing anklets? Then where did they go in the seconds between when the sound stopped and when my mother checked? How did they disappear so completely and so quickly from a street that had nowhere to hide? Could I have been dreaming? No, because I was fully awake. I had gotten up, moved around the room, drunk water, come back to bed. I was alert enough to check the time, to perceive details, to make the conscious decision to wake my mother. That is not the mental state of someone who is dreaming or hallucinating. Every rational explanation fails when you look at it closely, which leaves only irrational explanations. Supernatural explanations. The kind of explanations that my family was not willing to consider, because they are frightening, and because they challenge our basic understanding of reality. In Indian culture, there are many stories about spirits and supernatural beings that announce their presence through sounds. Pale specifically show up in folklore and ghost stories, often associated with female spirits or entities that want to make their presence known. The sound of anklets in the night, when no one should be walking, is considered ominous, a sign that something from the other world is nearby. I did not know all of these stories in detail when the experience happened. I was just a kid living with my family in a rented house, not someone who had studied folklore or supernatural traditions extensively. But I knew enough to understand that what I had heard was considered significant, was the kind of thing that appeared in scary stories for a reason. And experiencing it firsthand, hearing those anklets outside my window in the dark, confirmed what all those stories suggested, that there are things in this world, or perhaps things from outside this world, that make themselves known through sounds and signs that we recognize but cannot explain. I do not know what was outside my window that night. I do not know if it was a spirit, a ghost, some other kind of entity that Indian tradition has names for. I do not know why it chose our house, our window, that particular night. I do not know what it wanted or why it made its presence known to me specifically. But I know it was real. I know I heard what I heard. And no amount of skepticism or dismissal from my family has ever convinced me otherwise. The experience has stayed with me across the years since 2016. Not in a traumatic way that prevents me from sleeping, or makes me constantly afraid, but as a memory that holds a particular weight and significance. It is a reminder that the world contains more than we usually acknowledge, that our ordinary explanations do not always cover the full range of what can happen, that sometimes things occur that challenge everything we think we know about reality. I have had other strange experiences since then. Small moments where I have felt presences or heard things that should not be there. Nothing as clear and undeniable as the pale outside my window, but enough to make me understand that I might be someone who is sensitive to these things, who perceives what others do not, who lives with one foot in the ordinary world and one foot in whatever exists alongside it. And I have learned to trust my own perceptions even when others do not believe me, even when the rational explanations are not available, even when acknowledging what I experienced means accepting that reality is stranger and more complex than most people are comfortable admitting. I heard anklets outside my window at 2 a.m. That is the truth. That is what happened. And I am telling you this story now, years later, with the same certainty I had on the morning after, when I tried to make my family understand. They did not believe me then. Maybe you will not believe me now. But belief is not required for truth to be truth. What happened, happened. What I heard. And somewhere in Rajasthan in 2016, something wearing pile stood outside my bedroom window in the middle of the night and made sure I knew it was there. I will never forget that sound. The clear, unmistakable jingling of anklets in the dark. And I will never stop being certain that it was real. Next one story start now. 3 men followed us home and started banging on our door at midnight. The guy from the grocery store who wouldn't leave my friend alone showed up at our apartment door at 11:30 at night with 2 other men. And we were 4 college girls alone with nowhere to run. That is the nightmare I need you to understand before I tell you the rest of this story. Because everything that follows depends on you grasping how trapped we were. How vulnerable. How completely at the mercy of whatever these men intended to do. We were not in a dorm with security guards. We were not in someone's family home where parents could intervene. We were in a semi-empty apartment in a building where most people were already asleep, with all the lights off except for small night lights. And 3 strange men were on the other side of our door demanding to be let in through increasingly violent knocking and banging that made it very clear. They were not going to just give up and leave. This happened on February 19th, 2023. I remember the exact date because it is burned into my memory the way traumatic experiences are. The kind of date you will never forget no matter how many years pass. We were in the final year of our master's program, my 3 friends and I, at that stage of university life, where you are stressed about finishing your degree and starting your career, but also trying to maintain friendships and have normal social experiences before everyone graduates and scatters to different cities and jobs. We had decided to have a girls' night. Nothing elaborate, nothing risky or adventurous. Just the 4 of us spending time together in a safe, private space where we could relax and talk, and watch movies, and eat junk food without worrying about classes or assignments or any of the other pressures that filled our regular days. One of my friends had access to an apartment that her father owned. He was in real estate or property management or something similar, and he had this apartment that he usually rented out to tenants but that happened to be empty at the time. It was semi-furnished, meaning it had the basics like beds, and maybe a couch and a table, but was not fully decorated or lived in the way a permanent residence would be. It was perfect for our purposes though. A whole apartment to ourselves, private and quiet, with enough space for all 4 of us to be comfortable. We all arrived around 3:30 in the afternoon. Everyone brought contributions to the evening, bags of chips and bottles of soft drinks, because we were planning to stay up late watching movies and talking, and doing all the things that groups of friends do when they have a whole night together with no responsibilities or interruptions. The apartment was laid out in a simple, straightforward way. There was a central hall in the middle, and around that hall were 3 bedrooms and a kitchen. The design was functional rather than fancy. The kind of layout you see in many apartment buildings where the priority is making efficient use of space rather than creating something architecturally interesting. We spent the first couple of hours just settling in, arranging our stuff, deciding which rooms we would use, getting comfortable in the space. We turned on some music, opened the snacks, started talking and laughing the way you do when you are with close friends, and do not have to perform or pretend or be anyone other than exactly who you are. Around 5:30 in the evening, we realized we needed a few more things for the night. Maybe more snacks, maybe drinks, maybe just wanting to stretch our legs and get out of the apartment for a bit. There was a food mart nearby, a small grocery store or convenience store, the kind of place that sells everyday essentials and stays open reasonably late for people who need to grab something quickly. All 4 of us went together. It was still early evening, still light outside, still the kind of time when you feel perfectly safe walking around the neighborhood doing ordinary errands. We were just a group of college girls going to the store. Nothing unusual or risky about it. We were in the mart looking at items, comparing options, having the kinds of silly debates about which flavor of chips to get, that feel important in the moment but are really just an excuse to spend more time together. And that is when we noticed that a guy was paying attention to us. Or more specifically, paying attention to one of us. He started talking to one of my friends. Not in a polite, casual way that you might chat with a stranger in a store, but in a way that was immediately too familiar, too persistent, crossing boundaries that should have been obvious. He was asking personal questions, making comments about her appearance, trying to get closer to her than she clearly wanted him to be. My friend was polite at first, the way women are socialized to be even when someone is making them uncomfortable. She gave short answers, tried to create distance, signaled in every nonverbal way that she was not interested in continuing the conversation. But the guy did not take the hint. Or more likely, he took the hint and chose to ignore it because he did not care about her comfort or boundaries, only about what he wanted. He asked for her phone number. Not once, but multiple times, in that pushy, insistent way that some men have where they treat a woman's no as just an opening move in a negotiation, rather than as a complete answer that should be respected. My friend kept saying no. She was clear about it, increasingly firm as he continued to push. She told him she was not interested. She told him she did not want to give him her number. She tried every variation of no that a woman uses in these situations, hoping that one of them would finally get through to him and make him leave her alone. But he would not stop. He kept pressing, kept trying different approaches, kept acting like if he just found the right words or the right angle he could wear down her resistance and get what he wanted. Finally, my friend pulled out her phone and pretended to call her dad. She had a whole fake conversation right there in the store, asking her father to come pick us up, making it clear that there was a male authority figure who knew where we were and was about to arrive. This is a survival strategy that many women learn, invoking a father or boyfriend or brother, because some men will respect another man's claim on a woman even when they will not respect the woman's own stated wishes. The tactic seemed to work. The guy backed off, stopped pushing for her number, and eventually appeared to leave the mart. We waited a few minutes to make sure he was really gone, finished getting what we needed, and then headed back to the apartment. I want to pause here and talk about what this interaction was like from our perspective, because it is important for understanding why what happened later was so terrifying. Being approached by a pushy, boundary-violating stranger in a public place is not a rare experience for women. It is something that happens regularly, that we learn to navigate and manage, that we have strategies for dealing with even though we should not have to. But it is also frightening every single time. Because you never know which guy is going to be just annoying versus which guy is going to escalate to something dangerous. You never know who will take rejection gracefully and who will become angry or violent when told no. You never know which interaction is going to be a minor inconvenience and which one is going to turn into something that puts you in actual danger. In that moment at the mart, we thought we had successfully managed the situation. My friend had rejected him clearly. We had used the calling dad strategy. He had appeared to give up and leave. We thought it was over. Just another annoying encounter with a pushy guy that we had successfully deflected. We walked back to the apartment feeling relieved that it had not escalated further. We locked the door behind us, feeling safe again in our private space. We settled back into our evening, making food, setting up the movie we wanted to watch, returning to the relaxed, comfortable atmosphere we had been enjoying before the trip to the mart. The apartment had only the night lights on. We had not turned on the main overhead lights because we were watching a movie and the dimmer lighting was more comfortable, created a better atmosphere for the kind of cozy evening we were having. The central hall where we were gathered was lit just enough to see each other and move around safely, but it was not bright. This detail about the lighting is important for understanding what happened next and how scary it was. We were in a semi-dark apartment, just the four of us, in a building where we did not know the neighbors, in an area where we were not completely familiar with who lived nearby, or what the normal sounds and rhythms of the place were. The movie was playing. We were eating snacks. Everything felt normal and safe. And then, at 11:30 at night, the doorbell rang. Not a tentative, uncertain ring like someone might use if they were not sure they had the right apartment. A clear, deliberate ring. Someone pressing the doorbell with intention. We all froze. Looked at each other with the same question in our eyes. Who would be ringing our doorbell at 11:30 at night? None of us were expecting anyone. None of us had told anyone else where we were. This apartment was supposed to be empty, not a place where people would just randomly show up. The doorbell ring was followed by a pause, and then by knocking. 3 distinct knocks. Knock. 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 Deliberate and firm. We did not move, did not speak, just sat there in the dim light, trying to figure out what to do. And then it happened again. The doorbell rang, followed by another pause, and then more knocking. Except this time the knocking was not polite or measured. It was loud, aggressive. Bang, bang, bang. The kind of pounding on a door that is meant to intimidate, meant to demand attention, meant to make it very clear that whoever is on the other side is not going to go away just because you are ignoring them. All 4 of us were scared now, genuinely frightened in a way that made our hearts pound and our hands shake. Because we did not know what was on the other side of that door. In that moment, we ran through every possibility. Was it a ghost? Some kind of supernatural entity that had come to this empty apartment? Was it an animal somehow? That seemed unlikely, but we were grasping at any explanation. Or was it the worst possibility? The one that made us most afraid? Was it a human? And if it was a human, what kind of human rings someone's doorbell and pounds on their door at 11:30 at night? We whispered urgently to each other about what to do. Should we answer? Should we check who it was? Should we just stay silent and hope they went away? Every option felt dangerous in its own way. We decided we needed to check somehow, needed to know what we were dealing with, even though we were terrified of what we might see. One of us crept quietly toward the door, moving carefully in the dim light, trying not to make noise that would alert whoever was outside to exactly where we were in the apartment. There was a peephole in the door, the kind of small lens that lets you see outside without opening the door. or being easily seen yourself. One of us looked through it, and what she saw made all of us panic. There were 3 men outside our door. 3 men. Not one. Not the single guy from the mart who we had successfully gotten rid of hours earlier. 3 men, standing together, clearly working as a group, clearly there with some kind of coordinated purpose. And one of them, we recognized immediately. It was the same guy from the mart. The one who had been harassing my friend. The one who had asked for her number repeatedly despite being told no, over and over. The one who we thought had given up and left us alone. He had not given up. He had not left us alone. Instead, he had found out where we were, had brought backup, and was now at our door at 11:30 at night demanding to be let in. The fear that hit us in that moment is difficult to put into words. This was not the abstract fear of not knowing what was outside the door. This was specific, concrete terror based on knowing exactly what was outside the door, and understanding the danger we were in. This guy had followed us. Had somehow figured out which apartment we had gone to, even though we had been careful. Even though we had not told him anything about where we were staying. He had either followed us physically without us noticing, or had used some other method to track us down. And he had brought 2 other men with him, which suggested that whatever he was planning to do, he thought he would need help to accomplish it. 4 young women, alone in an apartment with 3 men outside the door who clearly had malicious intent. The math of that situation was terrifying. We were outnumbered in a way that made any kind of physical resistance impossible. We were in an apartment that we barely knew, in a building where we did not know the neighbors or whether anyone would help us if we called for help. We had no weapons, no training in self-defense, nothing but our phones and our voices and our ability to think quickly under pressure. We all started panicking. One of my friends started crying. Another was shaking so hard she could barely stand. We were all talking over each other, voices rising in pitch and volume as the fear took over. And the banging on the door continued. It was getting louder, more violent, more insistent. Bang. 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 The sound of fists or maybe something harder hitting the door with force that made us worry the door might not hold, might not be strong enough to keep them out if they really decided to break it down. We grabbed our phones and started calling our parents. Not because we thought our parents could get there in time to help, but because we needed someone to know what was happening, needed to establish a record of this in case something terrible happened to us. If these men broke down the door and hurt us, at least our families would know that we had called, would have some information about what had occurred. I cannot remember now exactly what I said to my parents on that call. I was crying, probably not making complete sense, just trying to convey that we were in danger. That there were men trying to get into our apartment, that we needed help. My friends were making similar calls, voices breaking, explaining the situation to their families, who were too far away to do anything but listen and feel helpless. The banging continued. And then we heard something else. Voices from the hallway. Other doors opening. The neighbors on the same floor, woken up by the noise, coming out to see what was going on. This was the first ray of hope we had felt since the doorbell had rung. We were not completely alone. There were other people in the building, people who could hear what was happening, who might intervene or at least be witnesses. We heard one of the neighbors, an older voice, shouting at the men, demanding to know what they were doing, why they were making so much noise in the middle of the night, threatening to call the police if they did not leave immediately. The banging stopped. We heard voices outside, the men arguing with the neighbor, making excuses or deflecting or possibly threatening them too. We could not hear clearly enough to know exactly what was being said. And then we heard footsteps retreating. The sound of the men leaving, moving away from our door, going down the hallway or the stairs. We waited, barely breathing, listening for any indication that they were coming back. Minutes passed. The hallway grew quiet again except for the neighbor going back to their apartment and closing their door. Slowly, carefully, we allowed ourselves to believe that they were really gone, that the neighbor's intervention had worked, that the threat of police had made them decide this was not worth pursuing further. But we were still terrified, still shaking, still processing what had just happened and how close we had come to something terrible. We spent the rest of that night huddled together in the apartment, none of us sleeping. All of us too frightened and too wired on adrenaline to even consider trying to rest. We kept the lights off because we were afraid of letting anyone outside know we were still there and awake. We spoke in whispers. We jumped at every small sound. When morning finally came, we left that apartment as quickly as we could pack up our things. We did not want to spend another second in a place that had gone from safe to terrifying in the span of one evening. In the days that followed, we heard through the neighborhood grapevine that the police had arrested 3 men in connection with multiple robberies in the area. I do not know for certain that it was the same 3 men who had been at our door, but the timing seemed too coincidental to be unrelated. The description matched. The fact that they had been operating as a group matched. We never found out for sure what they had been planning to do if they had managed to get into our apartment. Rob us, certainly. But whether robbery was all they intended, or whether there were worse plans that we escaped by having that door between us and them, I will never know for certain. What I do know is that being a young woman means living with a level of vulnerability that many people do not have to think about constantly. It means knowing that something as simple as rejecting a guy's request for your phone number can potentially escalate into him tracking you down with 2 other men and trying to force his way into where you are staying. It means understanding that the world contains people who do not accept your boundaries, who do not respect your right to say no, who feel entitled to access to you regardless of what you want. That night taught me that the scariest knock is not from a ghost or a monster. The scariest knock is from a human being who has decided you are prey, who has demonstrated their willingness to pursue you and corner you and refuse to take no for an answer. We were lucky that night. Lucky that the door held. Lucky that the neighbors woke up. Lucky that the threat of police was enough to make those men leave. Lucky that we had our phones to call for help even though that help could not arrive in time. But luck is not a safety strategy. Luck is not something you can count on. So this is my story, and my warning. Be careful who you reject. Be aware of who is paying too much attention to you. Notice if someone seems to be following you or tracking your movements. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. And understand that sometimes the scariest thing in the world is not supernatural at all. Sometimes it is just 3 men at your door at midnight, and you are alone, and there is nowhere to run. Stay safe. Please, stay safe. Next one story start now. My roommate demanded I pay $300 for calls I never made. I watched my phone bill climb to $300 for long-distance calls I never made. And when I confronted my roommate about his friends using my phone line constantly, he told me the charges were not his problem, and refused to pay a single cent. That is the moment I understood, with absolute clarity, that I had made a terrible mistake trusting someone to share my living space, and that I would never, ever put myself in that position again, no matter what circumstances life threw at me. I would live under a bridge. I would sleep in my car. I would find any alternative, any solution, before I would ever again allow another person to take advantage of me the way my roommates did during those nightmare years when I thought sharing housing would be a practical, affordable way to manage the cost of living. I was wrong. So completely, devastatingly wrong that even now, years later, I feel anger rising in my chest when I think about what I endured, what I tolerated, what I allowed to continue because I did not know how to stand up for myself, or because I was trapped by financial circumstances that made leaving feel impossible. Let me tell you about the married couple first, because they were my introduction to the world of bad roommate situations. And they set a pattern that I would unfortunately repeat with different people in different places until I finally learned the lesson that should have been obvious from the beginning. This married couple approached me. I want to emphasize that because it is important to understanding how this started. I was not desperately searching for housing. I was not in a crisis situation where I needed to find a place immediately. They came to me, the husband and wife together, and they begged me to move in with them. They presented it as a mutually beneficial arrangement. They had rented a house, a whole house with multiple bedrooms, and they were having trouble covering the rent and utilities on their own. If I moved in and took one of the extra bedrooms, I could split the costs with them, and everyone would save money. It seemed reasonable. It seemed like the kind of practical arrangement that adults make all the time to manage their expenses. The terms they proposed were clear and specific. I would pay half the rent. I would pay half the utilities. And if I made any long-distance phone calls, I would pay for those separately, since phone bills at that time itemized each call, and you could see exactly which numbers were called and for how long. I agreed. I moved in. I set up my bedroom in their rented house and began what I thought would be a straightforward, drama-free living situation, where we all coexisted as adults, sharing space and expenses. The first month went by relatively smoothly. We established routines, figured out how to share the kitchen and bathroom, learned each other's schedules. There were small annoyances, the kind that always come with sharing space with other people, but nothing major, nothing that raised serious red flags. And then it came time to pay the bills. This is where the problem started, and this is where I should have recognized immediately that something was very wrong and gotten out of the situation before it escalated further. The wife approached me with the amount I owed for my share of rent and utilities. She did not show me any bills. She did not provide documentation or receipts or any kind of breakdown that would allow me to verify the numbers she was giving me. She just threw a figure at me, a total dollar amount that I was expected to hand over, based entirely on her word. I asked to see the bills. This seemed like a completely reasonable request. We had an agreement that I would pay half of the costs, which meant I should be able to see what the actual costs were before calculating my half. I was not trying to avoid paying my fair share. I just wanted to confirm that the numbers being presented to me were accurate and matched what we had agreed to. She refused. Just flatly refused to show me the bills. She told me that she had already calculated my portion and I needed to pay it, and there was no reason for me to see the actual utility statements or rent receipts. This was a red flag. A huge, blazing, impossible to miss red flag that should have sent me packing immediately. Because there is only one reason why someone would refuse to show you bills that you have agreed to split with them. They are lying about the amounts. They are inflating the numbers, charging you more than your actual share, using you as a source of extra income rather than as a genuine cost-sharing partner. But I was young, or maybe just naive, or maybe too conflict-averse to push back as hard as I should have. I paid what she asked, even though I strongly suspected I was being overcharged, because I did not want to create drama or tension in the house where I was living. This pattern continued for several months. Each month she would present me with a figure, refuse to show me documentation, and I would pay it while my resentment and certainty that I was being scammed grew stronger. Finally, I reached a breaking point. I told her, clearly and firmly, that I would not pay any more bills until she showed me the actual statements so I could verify that I was being charged fairly for my actual share of the costs. This was not an unreasonable demand. This was not me being difficult or trying to avoid my responsibilities. This was me insisting on basic transparency in a financial arrangement that I had entered into with specific agreed-upon terms. Her response was immediate and hostile. She told me to pack my bags and leave. Not to work it out, not to find a compromise, not to show me the bills and prove that she had been honest all along. Just to leave. Get out. Take my things, and go, which confirmed everything I had suspected. She had been lying about the costs. She had been overcharging me, probably significantly, and when I finally insisted on seeing proof, she knew she could not provide it without exposing her dishonesty. So instead of admitting what she had been doing, she simply kicked me out. I was furious. Not just about the money, though that was bad enough. I was furious about the betrayal of trust, about the fact that these people had begged me to move in with them, and then had immediately started taking advantage of me. I was furious at myself for not standing up sooner, for paying inflated bills for months without insisting on documentation, for allowing myself to be used. But I left. I packed my belongings, and I moved out of their house, and I found another living situation, because I still needed a place to live, and I still needed to keep my housing costs manageable. And that is when I made my second terrible mistake. I got another roommate. I should have learned from the first experience. I should have understood that sharing housing with people, especially people I did not know extremely well, was a recipe for conflict and exploitation. But I convinced myself that the married couple had been an anomaly, that most roommate situations would be better, that I had just been unlucky the first time. I was wrong again. The new roommate seemed fine initially. We had our own separate spaces, our own bedrooms, shared the common areas. The arrangement was similar to the previous one, splitting rent and utilities, each person responsible for their own portion of the costs. But problems started almost immediately, and they were different problems from the married couple, but just as infuriating and ultimately just as destructive to the living situation. This roommate kept my phone tied up constantly. For younger readers who do not remember landline phones, you need to understand that before cell phones became universal, most homes had a single phone line that everyone in the household shared. If someone was on the phone, no one else could use it. And if someone called while the line was busy, they would get a busy signal and would not be able to reach you. My roommate used the phone constantly. Hours and hours every day, having long conversations with friends, making plans, chatting about nothing while I sat there unable to make any calls I needed to make because the line was perpetually occupied. But even worse than his own phone use was the fact that his friends used my phone constantly as well. They would come over to the apartment at all hours, day and night, and they would pick up my phone and make calls as if they lived there. As if they had any right to use a phone line that I was paying for. I would come home from work and find the kitchen a mess because his friends had been there making food and had not bothered to clean up after themselves. I would find people I did not know sitting in my living room using my furniture and my phone, and treating my home like it was some kind of public hangout space. The phone would ring at all hours, early morning, late at night, middle of the afternoon. It rang constantly, a persistent intrusion into what was supposed to be my private living space. And the calls were always for my roommate or his friends. Never for me, because anyone trying to call me could not get through, because the line was constantly busy, or constantly being answered by someone else. I tried to address this. I told my roommate that his friends needed to stop using my phone, that the constant traffic through our apartment was disruptive, that I had a right to peace and privacy in my own home. He would nod and agree and say he would talk to them, and then nothing would change. The friends kept coming. The phone kept ringing. The mess kept appearing. And then I got the phone bill. $300. For a single month. $300 in charges that appeared on the bill for my apartment, my phone line, my account, that I was responsible for paying. I looked at the itemized list of calls and I did not recognize a single number. Not one. These were not calls I had made. These were not places I had called or people I had spoken to. These were long-distance calls made by my roommate and his friends, using my phone, running up charges that I was now being held responsible for. I confronted my roommate with the bill. I showed him the charges, explained that these calls had been made from our apartment during times when I was at work or otherwise not home, made it absolutely clear that these were not my calls and I should not be responsible for paying them. He looked at the bill. He looked at me. And he said, with complete confidence and zero shame, that those were not his calls. He claimed he had not made them, had no idea where they came from, suggested that maybe I had made them and forgotten, offered every possible deflection and denial except the one thing that was obviously true, that he and his friends had been using my phone to make long-distance calls without my permission and without any intention of paying for them. I told him he needed to pay for the calls, that I had the bill, I had proof that the calls were made, and since I knew I had not made them, and he was the only other person with access to the phone, he was responsible for the charges. He refused. Just outright refused. Said he would not pay a single dollar toward a bill that he claimed was not his responsibility. I was trapped. The phone company did not care whose voice had actually spoken the words on those long-distance calls. They cared only that the calls had been made from my phone line, which was in my name, which made me legally responsible for payment regardless of who had actually made the calls. I had to pay the $300. Money I did not have, money I had to scramble to come up with, money that represented a significant portion of my monthly income. All because my roommate and his friends had used my resources without permission and then refused to take responsibility for the costs they had incurred. But even after all of this, even after the exploitation and the lies and the refusal to pay for what he had used, my roommate had the absolute nerve, the breathtaking audacity to ask me to leave when his friends came over. He wanted me to vacate my own apartment, to make myself scarce, to disappear from my own living space that I was paying for, so that he and his friends could have privacy and space to do whatever they wanted without me being around as an inconvenient reminder that this was supposed to be my home, too. I said no. Obviously, emphatically no. This was my apartment as much as his. I paid rent. I had every right to be there. I was not going to leave my own home to accommodate his social life, especially not after everything else he had already put me through. But the fact that he asked, the fact that he thought it was a reasonable request, showed me just how little respect he had for me or for the basic principles of shared living. In his mind, I was not a roommate or a co-tenant with equal rights to the space. I was an inconvenience, a source of money to cover costs he did not want to pay himself. Someone whose needs and comfort were completely irrelevant compared to what he wanted. That was the moment I made my vow. The promise to myself that I have kept ever since and will continue to keep for the rest of my life. I will never have another roommate. Never. Not under any circumstances. Not for any reason. Not if it means the difference between having a roof over my head and sleeping on the street. I meant it then. And I mean it now. I would live under a railroad bridge before I would share housing with another person who I had not known for years and trusted completely. I would sleep in my car. I would find a tiny studio apartment that cost more than I could comfortably afford. I would work extra jobs, cut every possible expense, do whatever it took to maintain my own independent living space. Because what I learned from those experiences, what was burned into my understanding through months of exploitation and disrespect and financial abuse, is that sharing housing with the wrong people is not just inconvenient or annoying. It is destructive. It damages your finances, your mental health, your sense of security and safety in your own home. The married couple who begged me to move in with them taught me that people will lie directly to your face about money, will exploit your trust and goodwill, will take advantage of your conflict-averse nature to squeeze extra dollars out of you month after month. And when you finally stand up for yourself and demand basic honesty and transparency, they will kick you out rather than admit what they have been doing. The second roommate and his friends taught me that some people have no concept of boundaries or respect, that they will use your resources as if those resources are infinite and free, that they will invite chaos and mess and constant intrusion into your life and then act offended when you ask them to stop. And when the bills come due for all the damage and expense they have caused, they will deny responsibility and leave you holding the bag. These are not lessons I wanted to learn. These are not experiences I would wish on anyone. But they are real. They happened, and they changed fundamentally how I approach housing and living situations. I hear people talk about roommates sometimes, especially young people just starting out, or people in expensive cities where renting alone seems financially impossible. They talk about roommate agreements and house rules and finding compatible people to share space with. And I understand why they do it, why sharing housing seems like a practical solution to the affordability crisis that makes independent living increasingly difficult. But I also know what I know. I have lived through what I have lived through, and nothing anyone could say would convince me to put myself back in that position. Because the truth is that most people are not good roommates. Most people, when given the opportunity, will prioritize their own convenience and comfort over fairness and respect. Most people will push boundaries, will take advantage, will use more than their share and contribute less than they should. Not because they are evil or malicious, but because human nature tends towards self-interest, and people generally will get away with whatever they can get away with. And in a roommate situation, there is almost always a power imbalance. Someone is more assertive, more willing to create conflict, more comfortable with confrontation. And that person, whether consciously or unconsciously, will dominate the shared space and exploit the person who is less assertive, less comfortable with conflict, more inclined to keep the peace. I was that less assertive person. I was the one who paid bills I suspected were inflated, because I did not want to create drama. I was the one who tolerated friends invading my space because I did not know how to effectively stop them. I was the one who got stuck with a $300 phone bill for calls I did not make, because I could not force my roommate to take responsibility. And I learned, painfully and expensively, that being that person in a shared living situation is a guarantee of being exploited. So I made my choice. I chose independence over affordability. I chose control over my own space and my own bills and my own boundaries over the supposed savings of sharing costs with others. And I have never regretted that choice. Not once. Not even when money was tight and an extra bedroom to rent out would have made things easier financially. Not even when friends suggested I could get a nicer place if I was willing to share it. Not even when the alternative was a tiny apartment in a less desirable neighborhood that cost more per square foot than a shared situation would have. Because I have peace now. I have privacy. I have control over who enters my space and when. I have phone bills that reflect only calls I actually made. I have utility bills that I can see and verify and know are accurate. I have a kitchen that stays as clean or as messy as I choose to make it, with no one else's dishes piling up in my sink. I have learned to live within my means in a way that does not require depending on or trusting anyone else to hold up their end of an agreement. And that independence, that security, that freedom from the constant stress of managing shared space with people who do not respect boundaries, is worth every extra dollar I pay for the privilege of living alone. The married couple who lied about bills taught me something valuable, even though I wish I had learned it a different way. They taught me that financial agreements mean nothing if the other person has no integrity, and that you cannot trust someone just because they seem nice, or because they approached you with what sounded like a fair deal. The roommate with the $300 phone bill taught me that some people will use everything you have, and then act shocked when you expect them to contribute or compensate. That responsibility is a concept some people simply do not operate with. And no amount of reasoning or evidence will make them acknowledge their role in creating problems. Both situations taught me that I am better off alone. That whatever I sacrifice in terms of apartment size or location or cost, I gain back 100-fold in mental peace and stability. So when people ask me if I have ever had roommates, I tell them yes. I tell them about the married couple and the phone bill and the friends who treated my apartment like a public space. And I tell them, clearly and without exaggeration, that I would live under a bridge before I would ever do it again. Because I would. I genuinely would. The railroad bridge, the car, the smallest studio apartment in the worst part of town, any of those options is preferable to sharing housing with people who will lie and exploit and disrespect and then act like you are the problem when you finally say enough. I learned my lesson. I paid for it, literally and figuratively. And I will never forget it. Never again. Not ever. Not for any reason. That is my vow. That is my truth. That is what bad roommates taught me about human nature and housing and the price of independence. And I have kept that vow ever since, and I will keep it until the day I die. Because some lessons, once learned, stay with you forever. And this is one of them. Last one story start now. He called her sister and she spared his life. Then he saw her hanging upside down from a tree. A woman was sitting in his courtyard crying in the middle of the night, and after he offered help and called her sister, she told him from the tree where she hung upside down that she would have twisted his neck if he had not shown her respect. That is the impossible, terrifying reality at the center of this story, and I need you to understand how specific and how deliberate this encounter was before I tell you everything else. This was not a random haunting or a vague supernatural experience. This was a test. A deliberate, calculated evaluation of character conducted by something that appeared human but was not. Something that had the power to kill, but chose mercy based entirely on a single word spoken in the darkness. He called her sister. That simple act of respect, that cultural acknowledgement of kinship and dignity, was the only thing that stood between him and a violent death at the hands of a spirit who had been waiting in his courtyard to see what kind of man he was. This story comes from a village in West Bengal, India, and it was told to me by my friend about his friend who experienced it. I am telling it now not just because it is frightening, though it absolutely is, but because it represents something deeper and more complex than a simple ghost story. It represents a pattern that appears across India in different forms, a phenomenon where female spirits encounter men in vulnerable moments and test whether those men possess basic human decency or whether they are the kind of men who exploit and harm women when given the opportunity. And what makes these stories even more remarkable is that these spirits, despite being entities that are categorized as ghosts or demons or evil beings in folklore, demonstrate a capacity for justice and mercy that many living humans lack. They punish the wicked. They spare the decent. They enforce a moral code that the regular world often fails to enforce. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you this story from the beginning, exactly as it was told to me, so you can understand the full weight and significance of what happened that night in a village in West Bengal. The man who experienced this was an ordinary person living an ordinary life in a rural area where traditional patterns of life continue largely unchanged despite modernization happening in cities. Villages in India, particularly in regions like West Bengal, maintain customs and structures and ways of being that have persisted for generations. The houses are often older, built in traditional styles with courtyards and separate structures for different functions. One particular architectural feature is relevant to this story. In many village homes, especially older ones, the bathroom is not attached to the main house. This is not unusual or considered a hardship in these settings. It is simply how houses were traditionally constructed. The toilet or bathroom would be a separate small structure in the courtyard or the area surrounding the main house, and you would have to go outside to use it. For people who have only lived in modern houses with ensuite bathrooms, this might seem inconvenient or primitive. But it is normal in many parts of rural India, and people grow up with it and think nothing of walking through open air to reach the bathroom, even in the middle of the night. This man woke up one night, needing to use the toilet. This is a completely ordinary occurrence, the kind of thing that happens to everyone at some point. Your body wakes you because it needs something, and you get up groggily, half asleep, focused only on taking care of the immediate need, and getting back to bed as quickly as possible. He got up from wherever he had been sleeping, and made his way through the house toward the door that would lead outside to the courtyard area where the bathroom was located. He was tired, moving on autopilot, not particularly alert or paying close attention to his surroundings because there was no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary. He stepped outside into the courtyard. This was an open space in front of or around his house, the kind of area that serves as a transitional zone between the private interior of the home and the public space of the village beyond. Courtyards in village homes are used for many purposes during the day: drying clothes, doing certain kinds of work, sometimes cooking or eating when the weather is pleasant. At night they are simply empty space, dark and quiet, serving as a path to wherever you need to go. And there, sitting in his courtyard in the middle of the night, was a woman. She was crying. Not quietly or subtly, but openly, the kind of crying that you do when you are in genuine distress. When something has happened that has overwhelmed you emotionally, and you cannot contain it. The man stopped. This was unusual enough to break through his half-asleep state and make him pay attention. Why was there a woman in his courtyard at this hour? Who was she? What had happened to make her cry like this? He did what any decent person would do in that situation. He asked if she was okay. He offered help. And the way he addressed her is crucial to everything that followed. He called her sister. In Indian culture, particularly in traditional village settings, the way you address people carries enormous significance. Calling a woman sister when you do not know her, when she is not actually your biological sibling, is an expression of respect and appropriate distance. It establishes that you see her as someone deserving of dignity, as someone who falls under the protection of kinship, even if that kinship is social rather than biological. It is the way a decent man addresses a woman who is not his wife or close relative. It signals safety, respect, acknowledgement of boundaries. It says, "I will treat you the way I would treat my own sister," which means I will protect you rather than harm you, will respect you rather than exploit you. So he stopped and he asked this crying woman, "Sister, why are you crying? Do you need any help?" She did not respond. She just continued crying, did not look at him, did not acknowledge his question or his presence, just sat there in the courtyard weeping as if he had not spoken at all. He waited a moment, perhaps thinking she had not heard him, or was too distressed to respond. But he was sleepy, and he really needed to use the bathroom, and he was in a hurry to take care of his business and get back to bed. So after that brief pause, after making his offer of help and receiving no response, he left her there and continued walking toward the bathroom. He did what he needed to do, relieved himself, probably splashed some water on his face, took care of the basic necessities that had woken him. And then he started walking back toward the house, back through the courtyard, ready to return to bed, and whatever remained of his night's sleep. The woman was not in the same place. The spot where she had been sitting, where he had seen her crying just minutes before, was now empty. He noticed this, but he did not think much of it. The obvious explanation was that she had left, had gotten up and walked away while he was in the bathroom. Whatever problem had brought her to his courtyard crying in the middle of the night, she had apparently resolved it, or moved on, or simply decided to go somewhere else. He took a step toward his house. Maybe 2 steps. Barely any distance at all. And then he heard a voice. It was shrill and nasal. Not the kind of voice that a normal human woman would have, but something higher and stranger and wrong, in a way that his brain registered immediately as not natural, not normal, not from anything that should be speaking to him in his courtyard at this hour. The voice said, "You called me sister, so I let you go today. Or I would have twisted your neck right away." The words hit him like a physical blow. The meaning was immediately, horrifyingly clear. This was not a woman. This had never been a woman. This was something else. Something that had been testing him, evaluating him, deciding whether he deserved to die right there in his own courtyard. And the only thing that had saved him, the only reason he was still alive and capable of hearing those words, was that he had addressed her respectfully. He had called her sister. That single word, that small gesture of basic human decency, had been enough to spare his life. But if he had not called her sister, if he had approached her differently, spoken to her disrespectfully, treated her as something to be used or ignored or violated, then she would have killed him. Would have twisted his neck, she said. A violent, immediate death delivered by something he had mistaken for a vulnerable woman crying in the dark. He followed the voice, his body moving almost without conscious decision, his mind needing to see the source of those words even as every survival instinct screamed at him to run, to get inside, to put walls and doors between himself and whatever had just spoken to him. And there she was. The same woman he had seen sitting in the courtyard, except now she was hanging upside down from one of the trees near his house. Not dangling limply like a person who had been hanged, but hanging in a way that suggested strength and control. As if hanging upside down from a tree branch was a perfectly natural position for her to occupy. Her body was inverted, her hair hanging down toward the ground. And she was looking at him with eyes that he could now see were not human eyes. Had never been human eyes. Even though in the darkness when she had been sitting on the ground he had not noticed, or had not allowed himself to notice. He stood there frozen, staring at this impossible sight, his brain trying to process what he was seeing and what had just happened, and how close he had come to death without even knowing he was in danger. And then he ran. Of course he ran. He ran back to his house, probably faster than he had ever moved in his life, slammed the door behind him, maybe barricaded it, maybe woke up everyone else in the household to tell them what had just happened, or maybe said nothing because who would believe such a story? But he lived. He survived. Because he had called her sister. That is the story as it was told to me. And it is not unique. That is what makes this so significant, so worthy of deep thought and analysis. This pattern appears across India, in different regions and different forms. There are multiple accounts from different parts of the country where female spirits encounter men at night, appear to them in vulnerable or distressed states, and then reveal themselves as something other than human after evaluating how the man responded to them. Men who treat these spirits with respect, who offer help without expecting anything in return, who address them with appropriate cultural deference, who recognize their humanity or apparent humanity and respond with decency. These men are allowed to live. Often they are even blessed or protected or given warnings about dangers they need to avoid. But men who approach these spirits with bad intentions, who see a woman alone at night and think of her as an opportunity for violence or exploitation, who demonstrate through their words or actions that they are the kind of men who harm women when they think they can get away with it, these men die. Horribly, often. Twisted necks, broken bones, found dead in circumstances that cannot be easily explained. This is a pattern that repeats across the folklore and the lived experiences of rural India. Female spirits testing men, punishing the wicked, sparing the decent. And what does this tell us? What are we meant to understand from these stories? I have thought about this a great deal since hearing this story and others like it. And I have come to believe something that the original storyteller also suggested. These spirits, when they were alive, when they were human women living in the world, likely faced grave injustice at the hands of men. India has a long and ongoing problem with violence against women. This is not a secret or a controversial statement. It is a documented, well-known reality that women in India face harassment, assault, rape, and murder at rates that are unacceptable, and that the justice system often fails to address adequately. Many women suffer terrible things, and their attackers face no consequences. Many women die violently, and their deaths are covered up or explained away, or simply ignored because women's lives are not valued the way they should be. And if you believe, as many traditional cultures do, that death is not the end, that consciousness, or spirit, or something continues after the physical body dies, then it makes sense that women who died violently or unjustly might remain attached to the physical world, might continue to exist in some form, carrying with them the rage and pain and unresolved trauma of what was done to them. But here is what is remarkable about these stories. These spirits are not indiscriminately violent. They are not killing randomly or harming innocent people just because they are angry at the world. They are testing, evaluating, making distinctions between good men and bad men, between those who deserve mercy and those who deserve punishment. A truly evil being, a demon or malevolent entity without any remaining humanity, would not care whether a man called her sister or not, would not spare someone based on a single word spoken with respect, would not demonstrate the capacity for justice and proportional response that these spirits consistently show. The fact that they can be appeased through respect, that they can recognize decency when they encounter it, that they can choose mercy over violence when the situation warrants it, all of this suggests that these are not purely evil beings. They are traumatized beings. They are beings who died with unfinished business, with rage that was justified by what was done to them, with a desperate need to prevent other women from suffering what they suffered. And so they remain in the places where they died, or where they lived, and they test men, and they punish those who fail the test, and they protect those who pass it. This is not evil. This is a form of justice that the living world failed to provide. When the man in West Bengal called that spirit sister, he was acknowledging her humanity. He was treating her the way he would treat any woman who deserved respect and protection. He was demonstrating, in that small interaction, that he was not the kind of man who harms women. That he was not the kind of man who sees a vulnerable woman and thinks of her as prey. And she recognized this. Despite her rage, despite her power, despite whatever terrible things had happened to her when she was alive, she could still distinguish between good and bad, still respond to basic human decency, still choose mercy when it was appropriate. That is what I find most moving about these stories. Not the horror of the supernatural encounter, though that is certainly present, but the persistence of justice and morality even in beings that we categorize as ghosts, or demons, or evil spirits. They are not evil. They are righteous. They are enforcing standards that living humans often fail to enforce. They are protecting women in death because they could not be protected in life. And yes, it is sad. It is heartbreaking that these women died violently or unjustly, that they suffered enough to remain earthbound after death, that they carry so much pain and rage that they exist in this liminal state between life and death. That is why the original storyteller ended with a prayer. May God save these souls from misery. May they attain peace. Because they deserve peace. They deserve rest. They deserve to be released from the trauma that binds them to the physical world, to move on to whatever comes next. To finally be free of the pain that keeps them hanging upside down from trees, testing men to see if they are worthy of living. I think about the man in West Bengal often. About how close he came to death without knowing it. About how a single word saved his life. About how he will probably be more careful for the rest of his days. More aware that the world contains more than he can see. More respectful toward women, knowing that respect might literally be a matter of life and death. And I think about the spirit who tested him. About what she suffered when she was alive. About how many men she has encountered since her death. About how many she has killed and how many she has spared, and whether keeping this vigil and forcing this test gives her any satisfaction or peace. I hope it does. I hope that every time she spares a decent man, every time she recognizes respect and responds with mercy, it helps heal something in her, helps restore her faith that not all men are monsters, that some men are worth sparing, that humanity still exists even in a world that failed to protect her when she needed it most. And I hope that every time she punishes a man who approaches her with bad intentions, every time she twists the neck of someone who sees a crying woman and thinks of how to exploit her rather than how to help her, it brings her some measure of justice, some compensation for what was done to her, some small restoration of the balance that was destroyed when she was harmed. These spirits are not evil. They are wounded. They are righteous. They are enforcing the standards that should govern human behavior but often do not. And the fact that they still possess enough humanity to distinguish between good and bad, to spare those who deserve sparing and punish those who deserve punishment, is astounding and worthy of respect. So when I hear stories like this, I do not react with simple horror or dismiss them as superstition, or explain them away as folklore that has no basis in reality. I treat them as truth, as testimony, as evidence that justice exists even when we cannot see it, that women who were failed by the living world have found ways to protect themselves and others in death, that respect and decency matter in ways that are more profound and more literal than we usually acknowledge. Call her sister. Treat women with respect. Offer help without expecting anything in return. See the humanity in others even when you are tired or busy or focused on your own needs. Because you never know when you are being tested. You never know when the person in front of you is measuring your character and deciding whether you deserve to live. The man in West Bengal learned this lesson. He called her sister and she let him live. And then he watched her hang upside down from a tree and understood how close he had come to joining the ranks of men who did not pass the test. May these spirits find peace. May their suffering end. May they be released from the trauma that binds them to this world. But until that day comes, may they continue their work. May they continue to test men and punish the wicked and spare the decent. Because the world needs them. Women need them. And the standards they enforce are standards that every man should be held to, whether or not there is a spirit watching from the darkness. Respect costs nothing. Decency requires only that you see others as human, and sometimes, in ways you might never expect. Those small acts of basic goodness are the only things standing between you and a violent death delivered by justice that the living world failed to provide. Call her sister. Treat her with respect. And live. That is the lesson of West Bengal. That is the pattern across India. That is the truth that these stories tell. And I believe it. Completely. Without reservation. Because some stories are too specific, too consistent, too meaningful to be anything other than true. This is one of them.